All right, so we'll talk sphenoid bone is our next bone to talk about. So I like this image here because the sphenoid bone is a bone that we really can't see on the outside of the skull. We have to take the skull cap off or split the skull down the middle to see it. This is the sphenoid bone that is in orangish yellow. It is a winged shaped bone that has a body in the center with two wings that come off of it. The best way to see this, and I like this because it shows us where it sits back in behind the eyes in the nasal cavity. And then we can see from a lateral view where it sits back right in here, line with the nasal cavity, behind the eyes. We can see in that proximity where it sits down in, just before or anterior to our external acoustic meatus, and then our temporal bones wrap around it on the outside. So we can see the sphenoid bone from a lot of different places when we look at the skull. So I'm going to put that back down there. So this is a view here, a lateral view with the face over here. This yellow bone right here, this is the sphenoid bone. This is the greater wing that comes out to the lateral margins of the skull. We then take the skull cap off, cut this off, remove it, look down inside. This is the frontal bone with the face. This is the occipital bone. This yellow bone right here, this is our sphenoid bone here. So this greater wing wraps up this way, and we can see it on the outside lateral portion of the skull. The sphenoid bone, we'll outline this here. So it has two major portions, or wings, if you will. This blue, I outlined this upper portion. This right over through here is, I'll tag both sides. This is the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone because it's smaller. When you're studying on the skull models and you get the skull, the lesser wing sits posterior to the frontal bone, and then the greater wing, can outline right with pink underneath here, comes up this way. This is the greater wing right in through here. We'll bring this over here. Now, it's the greater wing because it's larger. And that lesser wing sits up kind of like a stair step. The lesser wing sits right behind the frontal bone. Then there's a step down into the cranial vault right in through here. And then the greater wing is on both sides. Now, the midline right in through here is the body of the sphenoid. And we're not going to get into all of these different structures except for this spot right here. If we look at in the middle of the body of the sphenoid bone, we can't see it very well on this view. I'm going to go ahead and tag it, and then we'll look at some other views to look at it. Look at the structure. This right in through here, this black circle, this is the sella turcica, which is a Turkish saddle is what it translates at. Because when we look at this from a lateral split skull view, this sella turcica looks like a little saddle, and it's got a little concavity or C-shaped cup for the pituitary gland that hangs off the bottom of the brain to set into. Okay, we do have some different foramen that are within the sphenoid bone, but we are not going to worry about those for right now. Okay, so let's take a look. We can see in the sphenoid bone, this is the view where the sinuses have been removed, or the front of the skull has been removed, and we can see the sinuses. This green bone, unfortunately, the colors have changed. It was yellow on the last diagram. Now the sphenoid is green. We can see right in through here, we have the greater wing of the sphenoid right in through here. This is the temporal view. This would be the orbital view. So we can see the sphenoid in the orbital cavity. The other view I want to show you is in your notes. If we go to the lateral view where the skull is split right here, we can see the sphenoid bone really well. So this is the greater wing coming up right up here. Here's the body in purple. This is the sella turcica we were talking about before. It's a saddle for that pituitary gland to sit in. And then right underneath the sella turcica within the body of the sphenoid, this is the sphenoid sinus as well. Okay, so we can talk a little bit about sinuses at this point. We've skipped over those. A sinus is a hollow cavity that is lined with some epithelial tissue and goblet cells to produce mucus. Okay, yep. Well, so sinus, hollow cavity that is lined with epithelium. So we'll just write that down. A sinus. So we have a cavity lined with epithelium and goblet cells to produce mucus. So we can see, we'll look at the chart with the sinuses here in just a second, but we can see the sphenoid sinus here. On this view with the skull sliced down the middle in the sagittal section, we can see the frontal sinus here. But if we go to our sinus diagram, we see our sinuses right here. So we have the frontal sinuses that are bilateral over the eyes. So let's talk about our sinuses, or cranial sinuses. So we have frontal. These are bilateral. These are located above the eyes within the frontal bone. You can see an anterior view to the left. On the right, you can see a lateral view where you can see that cavity in there. The other ones that we also have the maxillary. These are also bilateral. These are in the cheeks, just lateral to the nose or the nasal cavity within the maxillary bone. Okay. Now, I want to change some stuff on the diagram. The ethmoid sinuses from the anterior view, we have a superior, a middle, and an inferior. So I would go ahead and write an S, an M, and an I for superior, middle, and inferior. This frontal view, these are really good because remember, your ethmoid sinuses are in the bodies of the ethmoid bone on both sides, lining the lateral walls of the nasal cavity. This lateral view, this is off just a little bit. It should look like this. Okay, these are not horizontal, these ethmoid sinuses, they're vertical. So that would be the superior, the middle, and the inferior there. It would just be on that lateral wall. We'll correct that diagram just a little bit. So we'll put in here, we'll put our ethmoids. These are bilateral. And on here, we also have a superior, a middle, and an inferior. Okay? Before we talk about the sphenoid sinus again on the diagram, the other bilateral sinus that we have is this mastoid sinus, which would sit right in here inside the mastoid process. It's not on this diagram, so I want to draw it in there. You'd have it on both the left and the right mastoid areas. That's another bilateral sinus. And then the last sinus we have is our sphenoid sinus. On this anterior diagram, it shows that it's two separate sinuses. It has a membrane in between there, but really it does show more as like one sinus. So I'll also put sphenoid. And that's centrally located in the midline sinus. So those are our 5 sinuses. We have the frontal, the maxillary, the ethmoid, the sphenoid, and the mastoid sinus. Okay. I think the last bone we need to talk about is the mandible. Okay. We'll do that in a separate video.